Okay, so the second module then is on different types of offenders. I'm going to start by talking about homicidal offenders. And as we talk about these different offenders, keep in mind the risk factors that we've already discussed in the first module. So let me just start by a couple of definitions, okay, so we know what we're talking about. When I talk about murder and homicide, I'm talking about unlawful killings. There are such things as lawful killings, okay, or justifiable homicides, whether it's in self-defense or soldiers killing when they're in duty, okay, or policemen shooting when their life is on the line and so on. So there are some lawful killings, okay. When we're talking about first-degree murder, I'm going to give kind of broad definitions, by the way. It differs somewhat from state to state. What constitutes premeditation, for example, differs from state to state, but these are kind of the broad definitions. So for first-degree murder, it has to be planned, it has to be deliberate, it has to be intentional, it has to be premeditated, okay? So this is a killing that's planned in advance and there's clear intention to kill, okay? So the most obvious example would be, for example, a serial killer, who plans out who they're going to select as their victim, how they're going to select them, how they're going to get them alone, and how they're going to commit the kill and so on, okay? Second-degree murder also is deliberate, okay? But it doesn't have the premeditation, okay? It's when you're in an argument with someone, you decide then and there that you're going to kill them, okay? But you still have the intent to kill, okay? But it wasn't planned in advance, okay? Or, from the news, some more recent examples would be road rage, okay, in which someone intentionally drives someone off the road or pulls out a gun and shoots someone who's annoys them on the road. These are clear examples of intentional murders, okay, but were deliberate at that moment. And then there's lesser charges, okay, which would be manslaughter. The simplest one is involuntary manslaughter, which is when it is unintentional, okay? You've taken someone's life, but you didn't mean to. So this could be killing someone in your car when you're driving recklessly, okay? So it's your fault, but you didn't intend to kill them. It was accidental. Or it could be a surgeon, for example, who's maybe operating under the influence, okay? And when drunk, they make a mistake that ends up costing the person their life, okay? It's a mistake, okay? But it's a result of negligence, okay? Recklessness. And then there is voluntary manslaughter, which is also killings that are intentional, but it's what's called a crime of passion. It's a crime in the heat of the moment, okay? So it's when your faculties are impaired, okay, because you're so emotionally overwhelmed, okay, that you just don't have control over your impulses, okay? Now, in reality, the distinction between second-degree murder and voluntary manslaughter is a difficult one, and sometimes different juries would reach different decisions, okay? But the kind of textbook examples are that voluntary manslaughter is, for example, you've just found out that your partner is cheating on you, okay? You get into a heated argument, and then in the heat of the moment, you pull out a gun and you do something to kill them. So it has to be something that would cause a reasonable person to lose emotional control, okay? Which is the clear difference between that and second-degree murder, okay? Which is, again, in that moment, you're choosing to kill someone, but whatever is bothering you, it's not reasonable to conclude that that would overtake someone's emotions, okay? So, for example, maybe I'm talking to someone and they correct my grammar or my pronunciation, and I decide I don't like that. That really annoys me. Okay, and so right then and there, I decide to teach them a lesson and to kill them. Okay, a jury is not going to believe that's reasonable. Okay, in terms of that overwhelming my emotional control. Okay, so that would be a clear difference between second-degree murder and voluntary manslaughter. So I'll give you some examples just to check that this is making sense. So two people get into a fight at a bar. One gets the advantage and continues to beat on the other. intending in that moment only to kill would be an example of second-degree murder, right? And someone plans to kill another person in a calm frame of mind, takes the necessary steps to carry out the killing. Right, clear first-degree murder. A husband discovers his wife is having an affair, loses control, kills his wife in the heat of the moment. Yep, you got it. And then someone recklessly discharges a firearm into a crowd of people, someone dies. Involuntary manslaughter, right? They've handled the gun recklessly, but they haven't actually intended to kill anyone. So like I say, you know, sometimes it's not actually in real life quite as clear determining what charge best fits the crime. But these are more textbook-like examples, and obviously in the exam, I'd only expect you to, you know, tell apart the more textbook cases. Okay, so talking about homicides more broadly, there's about 20,000 homicides committed every year in the US. Some things they have in common are that most victims are male. These are according to the FBI's numbers. And most offenders are also male, about 90%. About half the victims are black, half are white. And there's a similar breakdown also for offenders. More than half of victims know who their offender is, okay, whether it's a friend, a spouse, family member, more than half. And many occur during an argument or whilst committing another crime, okay? There's something else I should say actually about first-degree murder on that point of committing another crime, because sometimes, you know, a murder is committed, it wasn't planned in advance, but it was part of some other crime, like a sexual assault or robbing a bank, something like that. That's the other case in which it's classed as first-degree murder, if it's in the commission of another crime. So for example, if you rob a bank with a loaded gun, you're not intending to kill anyone, you're pretty adamant you're not going to, but then maybe there's a struggle, okay, and then, you know, your gun goes off and someone dies. That's first-degree murder, okay? It doesn't matter that it wasn't deliberate. You went into that crime knowing what the risks were, knowing the dangers, okay? It was a result of your crime, okay? Or if, for example, a rapist is sexually assaulting a victim, okay, and maybe they don't intend to kill them, but maybe they're harming them or strangling them or doing something that's part of their, you know, sick fantasy, and then it goes too far and they accidentally kill the person. That would be first-degree murder as well, okay? It doesn't matter, it wasn't intentional, it was part of a violent crime that was being committed. Now, when we break victims by sex, there are some clear differences, okay? And these differences actually are observed across countries as well. The actual statistics, of course, differ from country to country, but the overall difference between the sexes are much the same. So, for example, across countries, female victims are more likely to have been killed by their intimate partner than male victims. Okay, we're talking about 40% versus less than 10%. Female victims also more likely to have been killed by a family member. Okay, now in some countries, some Eastern countries, the sex difference is larger. Okay, on this point, but still across countries, female victims are more likely to have been killed by family members than male victims. Whereas male victims are more likely to be killed by a friend, an acquaintance, or a stranger, okay, versus female victims. Now, in the previous module, we talked about two different types of aggression, right? You have this reactive aggression, okay, that is in the heat of the moment, okay? If it results in a crime, it's a crime that's going to be disorganized, haphazard, spontaneous, impulsive, okay? And then you have the more predatory type of aggression, okay, which is more calculating, okay, or cold-blooded. You know, it's planned in advance. So about 80 to 90% of murders in the US are a result of reactive aggression, okay? It's, you know, a fight between two in a bar or two friends or two strangers that gets out of hand, or it's a spouse killing their partner when they're really riled up and angry, okay? Only a small minority of murders or the instrumental type, predatory type, okay, which are planned in advance, okay, calculating. But clearly, this is where most serial killers fall, okay, within this latter minority type. It wasn't really until the 1970s that, the idea of serial killers came to public attention, okay? And in the 1980s, the FBI began really studying this. This is the birth of the Behavioral Analysis Unit, led by Robert Ressler and John Douglas. If you've seen the Netflix show Mindhunter, it's based upon these two men. The main character is based upon John Douglas. And what they did in the 1980s was they decided to interview serial killers across the US to determine if there were any commonalities between them, if there was anything that was frequent in terms of a characteristic, okay, that might help them identify future serial killers or understand what causes serial killing behavior. The FBI in the 1980s estimated that there were about 35 serial killers operating at any given moment in the US. The most recent estimate by the FBI is 40, so it's higher, but not much higher. But there are some researchers and specialists in this area who argue it's much higher. Lawrence Miller, for example, who's one of the specialists in serial killers, a police psychologist in Florida, he also wrote the papers I have for your recommended reading this week. But he estimates that there's between 200 and 500 serial killers at large. Okay, this means uncaught in the US. I would say this is probably on the high end, but probably looking at all of the estimates together, realistically, it's probably between 100 and 200, okay, between serial killers who are active and uncaught. Certainly, the US has a much higher number of serial killers than any other country in the world. About 75% of the world's serial killers are in the US. Now, in comparison to some places in the world, it's obviously the case that the US has better abilities at linking crimes, okay, in comparison to, for example, some of the police agencies available in Asia, for example, if we're comparing those two places. But, for example, Europe has superior crime linkage abilities than the US has in terms of criminal profiling and so on. So that can explain, okay, why there's so many more serial killers identified in the US than in Europe. The reason for the difference will be multifaceted, okay? There will be many reasons, cultural, societal reasons, and so on. But certainly one reason is geographical. What we find in the US is that the less densely populated states are the states more likely to have serial killers. So, for example, Alaska has more serial killers than any of the other 49 states, which is the least densely populated state. Most of Europe is very densely populated, which makes it hard, okay, to get away with certain types of crimes like serial killing. But even though serial killing wasn't really brought to public attention until the 1970s, it's obviously the case that serial killers go back much, much further than this. Jack the Ripper is often thought of as the first serial killer, okay, from Victorian England, who killed at least 5 women uncaught. But actually, there's many, many examples earlier than this of serial killers across human history, okay? And I've just, put up some on this slide. But the Prince of Zhejiang, who was the emperor's nephew, was known for raiding nearby villages and killing civilians, basically for the fun of it. The first queen of Sri Lanka murdered her son and her 4 husbands. Reyes, who was a man in arms to Joan of Arc, was known to sodomize young children and to murder young children. It's thought he killed, in the upwards of hundreds. Elizabeth Bathory from Hungary was said to have killed her servant girls and then bathed in their blood, and she's thought to be the inspiration for Dracula. A lot of these kind of myths and legends about werewolves and vampires and monstrous creatures actually, in some cases, can be traced back to stories about horrific people. Lewis Hutchison, the first serial killer of Jamaica, but he wasn't native to Jamaica. He was a doctor from Scotland who moved there and called his mansion Edinburgh Castle and would hunt down anyone who came across his land. Delphine Lalaurie, a socialite from New Orleans, known to torture and kill her slaves. If you do one of the ghost walks or history tours in New Orleans, they usually go by her house and tell you some of the horrific stories. Burke and Hare murdered at least 16 people to sell their body to the medical school at Edinburgh University. So there's a number of examples. I've just, pinpointed some here, but of course, Jack the Ripper isn't actually the first true serial killer. Okay, what I'd like you to do, just take a couple of minutes, open up this link to a Google Doc, and write what you think the definition is of a serial killer. Okay, when I say serial killer, how do you think it's actually being operationalized, defined? What do you think it means? Actually, there is no universally agreed upon definition of serial killing. Okay, here is a number of them from the literature. And much like your own, you'll see that some specify intent, some don't, some specify a number more than 2, some specify a number more than 3. Some are a bit more open in terms of how many victims. If we use the FBI's original definition, it's 3 or more separate events in 3 or more separate locations with a cooling off period between the homicides. Now, this cooling off period element of the definition is to separate it from mass killing or spree killing. Okay, so mass killing is also a number of victims, but it's in one location at one point in time. Okay, whereas serial killing is usually different kills separated by a period of time, right? Now, some of these definitions specify how long the period of time has to be. So, for example, at least 24 hours between kills. Some of them are more open, okay? Now, there are always going to be problems with definitions, okay, including the one here by the FBI's. In some ways, it's too broad. This definition would include hitmen, assassins, serial bombers, serial arsonists, okay, other offenders who don't really have anything in common psychologically with serial killers, okay? And in some ways, it's too narrow because it specifies different locations, but some serial killers lured their victims back to their home. Jeffrey Dahmer, Dennis Nielsen, clear examples, okay, committed their murders in the one location. So technically they don't meet this definition, but in every other way, okay, they would be classed as serial killers, okay? A number of the definitions include some sort of sexual component, okay, that the killings are sexually motivated. Not all of them do, but most researchers in the field at least agree that there is usually a sexual component, maybe not in every case, but there is usually some sexual association with the crime being committed. Usually some act of voyeurism, okay, which is watching others for sexual excitement, okay, often not knowing that not often that they don't know that they're being watched, okay. So sometimes this might be part of the build-up to serial killing, that, for example, serial killers might stalk their victims, okay, follow them around. They then might fantasize over hurting them, and that this is maybe then sexually exciting for them. And then once that kind of wears off, they then take the step further and they actually live out the fantasies that they were dreaming about. It also might include watching the pain and suffering of the victims and getting sexually excited this way, which we would call sadism, right? If one is sexually excited through inflicting pain on someone else. I'm going to talk more about the FBI's interviews with the serial killers, okay, because it's an important study. But on this point, something they observed was that 71% of the serial killers had engaged in voyeurism, okay, and 79% had some fetish also, okay, that was often part of the crime, okay, that was part of what was motivating them. This is quite broad. Some serial killers have a particular fantasy. It might be inflicting pain and torture, humiliation on the victim. It might be some other fantasy that they force them to live out, or it might be a fetish for a particular body part. Okay, some serial killers have collected body parts or belongings from their victims. Some serial killers have collected and drank blood or saliva or ate their victims, and all of this might also be part of the fetish if that's what's sexually exciting them. If it's maybe the power and dominance, for example, that they like to feel over the victim. A couple of years after the FBI's study, Prentke and colleagues did a similar research design, interviewing serial killers across the US, and they discovered pretty similar findings in this regard. 75% of the serial killers had some fetish, 71% again engaged in voyeurism. And they compared this also to murderers who had killed once, okay, so single victim killers. In comparison, only 33% of those killers had a fetish and 43% had engaged in voyeurism. That's still quite a large number, okay, indicating that maybe many homicides are sexually motivated, but certainly the serial killers are scoring much, much higher, okay, in these numbers than the single victim murderers. So this study by the FBI, it's a pretty small sample, and it's now a fairly dated study, but it was important in terms of getting the ball rolling, okay, beginning researchers actually investigating serial killers. And they did find a number of common characteristics, okay, across cases. So for example, many of the serial killers came from homes in which there were problems with drugs or alcohol. Many of them came from homes in which at least one family member had a diagnosed psychiatric issue. And what was common was that they often reported feeling unseen and that their true value had never really been recognized, that they were victims in the world, kind of cast to the shadows, and that they were fighting, okay, and really had a sense of entitlement, but they were fighting for recognition. 70% of them admitted to being sexually incompetent, and a number of them preferred sex with a dead woman than alive. For two main reasons, okay. First, the power that it made them feel, okay. And second, obviously, if the victim is dead, then, well, the chances of rejection are obviously no, okay. And for these offenders, there was nothing often more terrifying or angering than the idea over being rejected, okay, by the object of their desires. And many of these cases had a stressor, something that pushed them over the edge, the last straw. So a breakup or the death of a loved one or going bankrupt, losing one's job, okay, some incident in their life, okay, that then had them go over the edge, okay, that they could tolerate no more after this. 33% said they were sexually abused as minors, and more than half had witnessed some sexual violence when they were children. So a number of them came from single parent homes, and the mother often worked as a prostitute. In many cases, they lived in one-room motels in which they were sharing a room with their mother, and this also was the room in which the mother was with her clients. And as a child, they were witnessing the act of sex, but they were also perhaps witnessing the client be rough and violent with their mother, or maybe even be beaten up. But more than half reported some, sexual violent acts, okay, that they had witnessed early that maybe had them begin to associate sex with violence. Other common characteristics, they were pretty much all white males who were operating alone. We now have about 50 years of research on serial killers, and we know now the actual breakdown in race is about 75 to 80% are white, okay? So it's still a vast majority of serial killers are white males. About half had a past criminal history. This varied, usually something sexually related. So maybe a sexual assault, but maybe also being indecent in public. But also in some cases, theft or physical assault. The other half had no criminal history whatsoever. Okay, once they were caught for serial killing, there was no criminal record of past crimes. The victims were largely same race females in their 20s. Again, looking at now about 50 years of research, this still stands up. 90% of serial killers kill within the same race, okay? Only 10% of serial killers kill someone of a different race than themselves. And they often took trophies. So this could be jewelry, clothing, body parts, anything that they want, okay, that will remind them of the crime. When I talk about this having a sexual component, you know, the serial killers often described the feeling as though a build-up of tension, okay, that they felt an urge to kill, and once they killed, it was a relief, okay, and they would be satisfied for a period of time, okay, but the tension would build and build again, okay, until again they felt an overwhelming urge to kill. Now, only a small minority of serial killers actually are legally insane, okay, despite what you might think from the media. So it's not the case that they don't know what they're doing is wrong, okay? It's not the case that this urge was actually uncontrollable in the sense that they had no control over their behaviors, okay? But it felt uncontrollable, okay? Yeah. I didn't give a percentage. I don't know the percentage, it's a minority. I do have a percentage on another slide, actually. So these trophies often helped with prolonging their satisfaction, okay, until they felt an urge to strike again. It would help them, you know, relive the crime, relive the act of killing, okay, in their fantasies, making it more real. The serial killers also had a modus operandi, or MO. Now, every criminal has an MO, okay? This is how one successfully executes a crime, okay? So if you're a bank robber and you take a gun and you hold up hostages and demand a ransom, that's all part of your MO, okay? The MO is the stages that you take to complete the crime, okay? Now, the MO can certainly evolve, okay? Nathaniel Code, for example, serial killer, would strangle his victims to death. Upon the first kill, he used what was there at the scene, and after that, he brought equipment with him, okay? So serial killers will often get better, if you like, okay, at the act of killing. They learn from previous mistakes. They begin to understand better how to be prepared for future crimes, okay? So the MO can certainly evolve, okay, across crimes, but it's how one successfully executes the crime. A signature is different because it goes beyond what's necessary to successfully complete the crime. It's overkill, okay? It gives insights into the psychology of the offender, okay, because it's unique and it's unnecessary. So in John Douglas's crime classification manual, which was distributed to police across the US, the example he gives of a signature is a bank robber who forced his hostages to undress, okay? There was no reason for it in terms of helping commit the crime. It wasn't making the crime easier to commit. It wasn't anything to do with the MO, okay? It was giving insights into him. It was part of his, you know, sexual deviant fantasy, okay? But the signature really could be anything. It could be overkill. It could be mutilating the body, something that's unnecessary, okay, that goes beyond what's necessary to commit the crime. Now, this first study by the FBI believed that a signature was a real key component to serial killing, okay? Now, looking at the decades of cases, only about 50% of serial killers actually have a discernible signature, okay? And the other 50% don't really have any clear signature. So it's not actually something that's clear in every single case, okay? Yeah. It could be. if it was removing something from the body, for example, and that was the trophy, that would be a clear signature. Yeah. Any other questions? Now, in this study by the FBI, they observed that there was a dichotomy in the serial killers, that some were more organized than others. Okay. Now, this dichotomy is actually used to describe now various types of criminals. Okay. Arsonists, rapists, it doesn't really matter. But originally, it was used to distinguish between different types of serial killers. And again, if you've seen the Mindhunter show, it goes into the birth of this dichotomy. The show, by the way, obviously dramatizes stuff, but the actual interviews that you see are pretty verbatim with the actual interviews that took place. So what they observed were that some killers were organized, some were disorganized in terms of how they committed the crime, okay? And that this also corresponded with how they lived their lives, okay? If you were organized in how you approached killing someone, so you were prepared, okay, then you were likely also prepared in other aspects of your life and organized in other aspects of your life, able to hold down a job and relationships and so on. Whereas if you were disorganized in how you committed a crime, you were likely also disorganized in your life, unable to hold down a job, unable to hold down relationships, and so on. So in terms of the organized offenders, they were usually at least reasonably intelligent, so at least average intelligence, but they were quite often underachievers. So they didn't really have good education attainment. You know, maybe they had done decently well at high school, but then didn't really pursue education beyond that. They often felt as though they had a job that was, you know, beneath them, okay, that they were capable of more. There's some exceptions to this, by the way. There's some educated serial killers who have college degrees and so on, but they are a small minority, okay? Most of the organized serial killers were underachievers. So they maybe did have employment, were often married, socially adequate. So this is the type of offender who's, you know, capable of fooling his neighbors and appearing charming, okay? The kind of offender that once they're caught, the neighbors say, well, I never suspected anything. They were always so nice and friendly and so on. But they often had psychopathic personalities. We'll talk about psychopathy later in the course, but it's an extreme personality disorder. That means one's very unemotional and callous, okay? Little regard for others, no real empathy, compassion, but also no fear, anxiety, guilt, empathy, sympathy, shame. And the organized offenders were usually sexually competent as well, okay? So they lived an ordered life, often killed after some critical event, so maybe losing a job or financial ruin, something that's a big stressor, and in some cases had a skilled job. So the organized offenders plan out the crime, how they're going to control the victim, how they can control the circumstances, okay? When is the victim going to be alone? When are they not going to be interrupted? Often choosing victims of lower risk, so hitchhikers or prostitutes or someone who's traveling alone, someone who might not be identified as missing straight away. They often bring their own weapons, their own restraints, okay? So they're bringing their own materials. And quite often these psychopathic offenders, before killing, will commit rape and will torture the victim. Usually it's in a slow, painful manner to prolong the death, okay? So there's often a sadistic element here, enjoying the pain being inflicted on the victim. The body often hidden or removed to help conceal one's crime. So they're more likely to dispose of evidence, okay? And maybe dismember the body to help delay identification. The disorganized offenders, on the other hand, below average intelligence, much more likely to be severely psychiatrically disturbed, okay? So psychopathy is a disorder of the personality, but it doesn't mean one is legally insane, okay? The disorganized offenders were more likely to be psychiatrically ill and delusional, okay? And therefore meet the criteria for insanity. Because of this, also often previous contact with the mental health system, few relationships outside their immediate family, sexually incompetent, if any history of relationships at all. The crime committed in the heat of the moment, okay, so spontaneous, often live alone, unemployed, or in unskilled jobs. So this is not the type of individual who can come across as charming and fool the neighbors, okay? This is the sort of individual who's described as being a creep and a weirdo, okay? And so when they're caught, it's of no surprise to those who knew them. And these crimes, really little to no premeditation or planning, okay? The weapon is one of opportunity. It's one from the crime scene, not one they've brought with them. And often left behind at the crime scene as well, because they take less efforts to dispose of evidence and to evade capture, okay? The victim is often selected at random, because remember, it's in the heat of the moment often, or impulsive. Overpowered, often killed in a blitz attack, so from behind a surprise attack. And there's often dehumanization, okay? Forcing the victim, for example, to wear a mask or something to conceal their face, or dismembering the face until it can't be recognized. Now, the disorganized offenders are less likely to be psychopathic than the organized offenders, meaning that they are still likely to have some sense of right and wrong, okay? Some degree of empathy, some conscience. It's going to be weak, obviously, because they're committing these crimes regardless, okay? But quite often, this dehumanization will help them not see this person as actually human, okay? That they're merely an object for their sexual gratification, a part of their fantasy, okay? They're trying to distance themselves from the fact that this is, an actual person with family and actual suffering of pain and so on. Whereas a psychopathic offender would not care, right? Which is a clear difference between the organized and disorganized. Because they take little effort to conceal the crime, body often left behind. If it is removed, it's more of a souvenir. And they often leave evidence, okay? Blood, semen, weapons. When I was talking about the number of serial killers, by the way, in the US, that's certainly going to decrease because the technology for identifying who DNA belongs to is becoming so much better that we don't even need to now have the actual person's DNA on file. We only have to have a relative, even a distant relative, and they can be caught that way, which is why there's now more cold cases being solved in the US than ever before, right? And so we're now at a point, really, where if you leave DNA at a crime scene, it's not a question of whether you'll be caught, you will be caught. The question is when you'll be caught. But the FBI recognized that not all offenders could be clearly split into one of these categories, okay? And in 1992, they developed a third type, the mixed offender. So they recognized that there's going to be overlap, okay? And in reality, an actual offender isn't going to be textbook. They'll have some organized behaviors, some disorganized, okay? And then it's a bit subjective in terms of where do they best fit, okay? What seems to be describing them best. But the mixed offender is the one that can't clearly be categorized, okay? So it's not the case that they're more this or more that. They seem to be more kind of 50-50, if you like. So a clear example is the Zodiac killer, right? The Zodiac killer was very, very organized in many ways, concealed his face, brought equipment with him, okay, to help commit the crimes. But he also left victims alive. He left evidence behind at crime scenes. He was seen by some witness, which is where the famous sketch comes from, okay? So it's quite a mix of organized behaviors and disorganized behaviors in the nature of that. But the mixed offenders quite often under the influence of alcohol or drugs, previous legal troubles and criminal histories, sometimes committed by more than one offender. And, there might be a disturbance to them committing the crime that's throwing them off. Maybe they're interrupted. And so it's not the case that there's evidence left behind because they're disorganized and they're not thinking about it, but it's because of this other, situational variable, okay, that's throwing them off, or some victim resistance. Quite often also, though, there will be a change in the serial killer's pattern. They might, like I said, get better at their craft, if you like, and learn from previous mistakes. But also, often serial killers will de-escalate, okay, become more disorganized. Clearly evident in Ted Bundy, for example, who was initially very, very organized, was thinking through for a long time on how to commit this crime, how to get away with it, had thought through every detail. And then over the crimes, okay, became increasingly more disorganized. Part of this is because as one becomes overconfident, they get sloppy, right? They begin to have this feeling that they're never going to get caught. They've got away with it so long, they become less careful. You might also make the argument that sometimes serial killers want to be caught. Like I said, they're often fighting what they think is a sense of injustice, that they want to be seen and acknowledged in the world, that they've been cast into the shadows. And perhaps later in their careers, they eventually want to be notorious, that they want to be acknowledged for what they've done, okay? So if you aren't familiar with Ted Bundy, he would stalk his victims for several weeks before committing the crimes in the early days of his crimes. He would have a number of ruses, okay? So for example, he would pretend to have a broken arm, making himself appear harmless, ask a female victim to help him put something in the van, and then he would strike them from behind and push them into the van and drive away. So he was organized in terms of how he was going to get this victim in his clutches. Thought to have committed about 30 murders between 74 and 78. And clearly psychopathic. He had this mask of sanity, okay? He was able to come across as charming, socially competent, okay, fool those around him. But like I say, regressed and became more disorganized. Okay, any questions on the organized, disorganized dichotomy? Distinction clear? Okay. Another way of separating serial killers is by motivation, okay, which is the Holmes and Holmes model. This argues that there's 4 main types of serial killers, okay, based upon motivation. The first is visionary, okay? So they're killing because of some hallucination, delusion, visions that they're experiencing, okay? So they're certainly likely to be mentally ill, have a psychiatric issue, and the crime is often also disorganized, okay? Because they're not really thinking clearly, okay? The second type is the missionary serial killer, who believes they're killing for some higher purpose, okay? That they're cleaning the streets of those who are undesirable, or killing those who are committing sins, or they're on some righteous journey, that they're doing something that's part of a mission, okay? And this is part of why they're committing the kills. The third type kills for power, dominance, feeling of control over their victim. So this is the type that's more likely to strangle their victims to death, okay? Clearly that gives them a sense of power and control because they're actually controlling with their own hands when one lives and when one dies and when one has their last gasp of air. Also, they're likely to have been abused as children. So this is where their feelings of powerlessness would have stemmed from. And when they were children, they would be unable to confront the target of their rage, like a parent who's much larger than they are. So instead, they have fantasies okay, over gaining power over others, never being victimized again, okay, having control, being dominant, and this becomes, you know, a fixture of their personality, these violent fantasies, until one day they decide to act them out. And then the hedonistic serial killer can be broken down into 3 subtypes. Okay. The first is the lust killer, killing because it's sexually exciting. It's part of their sexual fantasy. Okay. And then the thrill killer, it's exciting, but it's not giving them sexual excitement. Okay. It's energizing them, it's stimulating them. Okay. So it's some other form of excitement. And then the comfort killer, who kills for financial gain, okay, who's killing for money or property. In male serial killers, this is a infrequent type of serial killer. When we talk about female serial killers, we'll talk about the Black Widow, who's the most common type of female serial killer, you know, who kills her husbands so that she can inherit their money and property. Which would be a clear comfort serial killer. Okay. There's few male examples, but you know, the type in Criminal Minds, for example, who kills everyone who lives in a home and then lives in that home until they might be discovered and then moves on to another home, okay, to kill those. Andrew Conanan is one example. There was a good show on Netflix, American Crime Story. The first season was on the O.J. Simpson case, which was, I think, very good. And then the second season was on Andrew Conanan. There's less known about Andrew Conanan, so they had to take kind of more leaps in terms of what might have actually happened. But you see clearly that he was like, you know, like a parasite, living from leeching off one victim, okay, killing them, living in their house, using everything that they owned, and then moving on to another victim, okay, and another victim who wouldn't be discovered immediately as having gone missing, okay, so someone who was retired, for example, and who lived alone. Now, this typology is a little bit problematic, okay? It has little empirical support. A lot of research has been unable to identify missionary serial killers in their samples because it's a very rare type of serial killer. But also there's clear overlap, okay, between these types. There's pretty much a power control element to all serial killings, okay? So classing them as one separate type is difficult, okay, when there's going to be some power control element. And the power control element might be part of the sexual fantasy as well, okay, that then obviously makes it difficult to class one as a lust killer or a power control killer. So quite often these killers are not motivated by one thing, okay, which is why it's not the best model for that reason. You know, I would view serial killers more in the way of there being 2 dimensions. There's a dimension for mental illness, mainly schizophrenia, and there's a dimension for psychopathy, okay, psychopathic, callous, unemotional traits. The former 2 types, the visionary serial killer and the missionary serial killer, are usually higher on the mental illness spectrum, whereas the other types are usually higher on the psychopathic spectrum, okay? But they're higher in different characteristics of psychopathy, okay? I'll give you a couple of examples. They should be obvious. So Richard Chase, also known as the vampire of Sacramento, he drank his victim's blood because he believed his own blood was turning into a powder and he needed to replenish it by drinking blood. He's obviously a anyone? Yeah, he's a visionary serial killer, right? He's having this delusion over something that's clearly not real. Joseph Paul Franklin targeted interracial couples, some white and black, but mostly Jew and non-Jew, because he believed it was a crime against God. Obviously a missionary serial killer, right? Maybe you're familiar with some of these characters. So we have Hannibal Lecter from the Hannibal series. If anyone's familiar, do you know where he might fall? Anyone familiar with it? Yeah, okay, both hedonistic and power control. Yeah. Certainly in one of the first episodes, right, he compares himself to God and talks about how much God must enjoy the power over life and death. So I think there's a good argument for the power control. Kevin Spacey's character from Seven, John Doe. So if you haven't seen it, he's committing a series of murders, one for every deadly sin. So killing someone who's committed envy, killing someone who's prideful, and so on. So he's a missionary serial killer. Sugar from No Country for Old Men, right? Anyone seen it? Yeah, where do you think he falls? Okay, right. Anyone else seen it? So he's a hitman, right, who's hired. So you could put him under the comfort category. But it's pretty clear he does it for a reason beyond that. He actually seems to enjoy what he's doing. So there's, again, overlap probably between these hedonistic categories. Norman Bates from Psycho. Okay, you think so? Why? Okay, okay, yeah. Sorry, someone said something? Yeah, why? Right, yeah, okay. He's certainly delusional, right? Again, there's going to be maybe some overlap. I won't spoil the ending because it's a movie worth watching, okay? But yeah. And Dexter. Missionary, why? He kills murderers, but is that actually why he kills? It's a reason he's given himself to justify killing, right? But the reason for killing goes deeper than that, right? So you could place him as missionary, but I think there's probably some hedonistic element as well. Yeah. So again, here you're seeing the difficulty, right? There's going to be overlap between the motivations.